Alright everyone, so this is part 1 for chapter 52. Chapter 52 as a whole encompasses both our introduction to ecology, how we study it, the levels of organization, all that sort of idea, and then the second part to the chapter really starts going into the biosphere itself. So why do we see biomes in certain areas, what's the climate, the distribution of organisms, and how that all ties back into both the geology of the area, the climate of the area, and taking a look at the big picture in terms of global distribution of all of this, and how does that tie into where the sun comes in, and how does the sun interact with our atmosphere to give us the weather patterns and the climates that we see. So if we take this really at the big picture, which is really what chapter 52 is really all about, we've got to remember that ecology is the scientific study, and we're studying the interactions between the organisms, or the biotic, the living factors within our environments, and how does that interact with the abiotic stuff, your non-living things, the rocks, the rivers, the weather patterns. All of these interactions between these organisms and those abiotic things really determines where organisms can live, how many organisms can be in that environment, and how that can shift as we see things like climate change coming into play. Ecology really has been, up until more recently, a very descriptive science. So we go out, we observe, we write down what we see. This squirrel is interacting with this tree and helping to distribute its seed, that kind of thing. But more and more recently, we're getting much better at making this more of a rigorous experimental science, especially with the introduction of technology and being able to stick cameras out in the middle of nowhere and be much less of a disturbance ourselves on the environment as we study it. All right. So if we kind of remember our scope of ecology, we can study global, all right, or we can go all the way down to talking about individual organisms. And this, if you've seen some of this before, the ecosystem, the community, the population, really is looking at how do we study ecology at the different levels of organization for our biosphere. We can study it all the way up to being the entire globe as a whole. So global ecology, really examining the influences of energy and materials on the organisms themselves, and how does the distribution of that energy or of those materials determine where we're going to see different organisms based on their needs. So our biosphere, if we remember the definition there, is just the sum of all of our planet's ecosystems. It's really looking at the planet as a whole. And a lot of these global studies are actually happening now outside Earth. We're using satellite technology and that sort of idea to study the globe as a whole rather than individual pieces. We can zoom in a little bit further and take a look at either landscape or seascape if we're talking oceans, and looking at how these ecosystems are arranged within a different geographic region. So let's just say we're looking at North America. How do the different ecosystems sort of patch out or kind of look like this mosaic? And how can we study the interactions between that? Because a lot of places, those landscapes are going to overlap. And so how do we see the focus or the change in something like the picture, where you've got that river running through and you can see that there's a lot of green right along the banks, and then we're starting to spread out into much more of a desert environment. How do those interactions between those multiple ecosystems determine the energy that gets transferred, the materials, the organisms, and all of those interactions? Still looking at a pretty big picture. Zoom in even more, and now we're just looking at specific ecosystems. So here you're going to focus a lot more on your energy flow, your chemical cycles are going to come in and be much more of an influence within the ecosystem. Here we're looking at organisms in that particular area, so the buffalo, the grasses, the birds in the picture, the trees in the background, and how are those interacting with the abiotic factors in their environment, the streams that are obviously running through the picture, and the nutrients that those are bringing from, say, the mountains. If you go all the way back in the distance of that picture, you can see the mountains. All right, and so we're looking at how all of that sort of ties together. What's the productivity of the environment and so forth. Sometimes all we want to do is study the organisms themselves and how do they interact with each other, and that's where we get into your community ecology. Remember, your communities are all the different living things. Now we're just talking biotic here. All the living things that are in your ecosystems, the plants, the monkeys maybe in this jungle, that are interacting with each other. And so now we start focusing on things more like predation, competition. Disease might play a role in how things get transferred from one thing to another. All right, and how does all of that sort of affect the community structures and the organizations that we see within a particular ecosystem, but just focusing on the living stuff rather than including the abiotic, although obviously that has a great impact on how all of that stuff gets structured. Other times we're just looking to focus on one particular organism, and so we're looking at populations. All right, so a group of individuals, they're the same species, and they're all living in the same general area, whatever we define that to be, given the topic of questioning, the line of questioning that we have. And so here we may be looking at things like disease and how does that get passed from one individual to the next. We could be using some of this to look at evolution. All right, we'll talk more about that once you guys return to school. But remember that evolution happens at a population level. So there is going to be some crossover between our study of evolution and our study of ecology, because it's the environment and the way that those populations are structured that can ultimately determine whether evolution is happening or not. And sometimes we go even further and we're looking strictly at organisms themselves and their internal structure, their internal physiology. How does their body work? And for animals, we can focus on behavior. So chapter 51 is all about animal behavior and how does that interaction play a role in how organisms behave and utilize each other, utilize the abiotic materials in their environment, all right, to meet those challenges to survive. All right, and so yet again, evolution's going to come back here. We'll talk about the behavioral stuff and the physiological stuff. We won't get into as much, but if you've taken a nat and phys, you've at least seen it from a human perspective, and a lot of those body systems apply to a lot of the major big organisms we might be studying. So ecology often gets lumped with conservation, where we're really concerned about our impact on the environment and what does that look like for the organisms who live there. Ecology really provides us the science that underlies those particular environmental issues. And environmentalism really came about back in the 1960s. And Rachel Carson, who is pictured here, and her book Silent Spring, really was credited for starting our modern environmental movement and advocating for the protection, the preservation of our natural environment, with the understanding that we can't just go out and do what we want. What we do has an impact on the environment around us. And we can't forget that over time, those impacts can have huge repercussions not only on the organisms around us, but ultimately it's going to come back and kind of bite us in the butt. And so we need to be aware of our impact, minimalizing that impact, making sure we're making smart decisions when we know we're making an impact to minimize it or to at least understand what's going to happen. And she was really one of the first people credited with pushing that out there and kind of putting it in people's faces and saying, look, we can't just keep on building and tearing things apart and polluting our environment, because it's not just the organisms out there that are getting affected, but eventually it's going to come back to us as well. So most ecologists kind of follow what we call this precautionary principle. And all they're really saying is that we need to be concerned about how we affect our environment and to really try to minimize the impacts we make. They're not going to go as far as to say we should make no impact. That's kind of impossible given where we are globally as a society. But to be aware that what we're doing makes an impact, to try and find ways to minimize that impact, and wherever possible to kind of reverse some of the impact we've already made, to reverse some of the damage we may have done. All right, and so that's really what they're getting at.